In almost any classroom, adults rigorously define learning targets and point toward them, while the student looks in an entirely different direction. The state, the school, and the teacher know exactly where the child should be going, but the learner often feels zero connection to the destination. To understand why this disconnect happens, we have to look at the etymology of the word goal. Historically, it originates as a physical mark or target. Over time, the definition expanded to mean the result to one strives. This requires two things: a specific target and the persistent action required to hit it. You can assign a target. You cannot assign persistent action. Striving requires a motive. A person only pushes through difficulty when they understand why the outcome is necessary for their own progress. State-mandated curriculum standards successfully define the teacher's objectives, but handing those abstract requirements to a student does not create a drive to learn. To the learner, these documents are inherently meaningless. Bridging this gap requires a shift in perspective. Goal setting and formative assessment are not separate sequential teaching strategies, but rather two halves of a single continuous cognitive loop. We can derive a complete architecture of diagnostic tools to create this loop. These tools scale from year-long course planning down to multi-week topics, and finally to the execution of a single lesson. This type of structured approach provides the exact mechanism to translate rigid state requirements into personalized, internalized student motivations. At the macro level, we begin with the state's thematic classifiers. These allow a teacher to define the baseline educational objectives for the entire academic year. But instead of just presenting a syllabus, the teacher introduces a course navigator and an entrance questionnaire. These serve as the first translation mechanisms between the state and the student. The questionnaire asks students to analyze the year ahead and anticipate friction points, prompting directly, "What will I need help with?" It then pivots to utility, forcing them to map out how they expect to use these skills in the real world. Answering these specific questions requires the student to project themselves into the curriculum. They are mapping their own path before the first lecture even begins. For the teacher, this provides a localized map of classroom motivations. You can see exactly where individual students expect to struggle and what they value, allowing you to tailor the instruction that follows. This macro-level questionnaire anchors abstract state goals to the student's personal reality, establishing the bedrock for self-regulation. We then shift the scale down to a specific multi-week instructional unit, such as a module on syntax or lexis. Here, we deploy a diagnostic iteration method. This process is carried out strictly before any theoretical instruction takes place. First, students must rank their own perceived knowledge of the upcoming topic on a scale from 1 to 5. They take a diagnostic test using black ink. No correct answers are provided. The goal is simply to establish a record of their current understanding. After learning the core theory, students return to that same test, correcting their work in red ink. This two-color contrast transforms an abstract learning objective into a visible, individual to-do list. By identifying exactly where their initial logic failed, the student can see the specific steps required to reach the target. To manage this curiosity, we use a success criteria rubric. It is structured entirely on I know, I can, and I understand syntax, using a 0 to 2 scoring scale. Students score themselves on these exact metrics twice, at the absolute beginning of the topic and at the very end. By visualizing the knowledge gap before a formal grade is assigned, students actively construct their own learning targets rather than passively receiving them. At the most granular level, we focus on the execution of daily classroom tasks, analytical exercises, and creative writing. The lesson begins with the teacher introducing an interactive Bloom's taxonomy matrix as an active goal-setting mechanism. Autonomy requires choice. Students must consciously select their target cognitive tier for the day, deciding whether to aim for basic recall or push toward high-level synthesis. For example, if a lesson involves writing a fairy tale based on the frog princess, the student undertakes a task requiring complex evaluation and synthesis. To assess this type of creative lesson, we use a tripartite evaluation sheet. The columns are filled in sequence. The student grades their own work under My Evaluation, followed by classmates' evaluation, and finally, teacher's evaluation. Classmates then use the exact same rubric to provide their assessment, which is followed by the teacher's final input. When students are given clear parameters, their self-evaluations and peer assessments are frequently more demanding than the teacher's grading. This tripartite system transfers the cognitive load of assessment directly to the learner, forcing them to deeply internalize the standards of quality. Formative assessment functions as a compass, providing direction while the student is still en route to their goal. When we use these diagnostic tools, the teacher's targets and the student's motivations align. The classroom is no longer a set of misaligned vectors, but a single, focused effort. This alignment allows the classroom to meet the state's requirement for developing student self-organization and self-control. To close the cognitive feedback loop at the end of a session, we use a parking lot of ideas exit typic. This board includes a specific prompt designed to measure psychological shifts, what I didn't think I could do until today. By highlighting specific moments of growth, this prompt shifts the focus from what the teacher provided to what the student actually achieved. True educational success is not achieved when a student hits a teacher's target, but when the student possesses the tools and autonomy to define, measure, and hit their own.